All right, everybody, get your engines fired up. It's time for Lights Out, Let's Chat.
Okay, Spa just happened, and honestly, this race felt like Formula One looked at the championship fight and said, let's make this as emotionally uncomfortable as possible. Because we had Kimi Antonelli coming into the weekend after that brutal Silverstone heartbreak, and instead of folding, he put the car on pole and won the Belgian Grand Prix. We had Charles Leclerc lead for a good chunk of the race and almost make it 2 Ferrari wins in a row. We had Max Verstappen on the podium at a track where Red Bull desperately needed a good result. We had Lewis Hamilton get a 5-second penalty after contact with George Russell on lap 1. We had Russell out of the race immediately, which is a massive championship hit. We had Ferrari fined for an unsafe release after Hamilton clipped a mechanic during a messy pit stop situation. We had Oscar Piastri and Charles Leclerc make contact and the stewards say no further action. We had Lando Norris start lower than he should have because of a power unit penalty and then recovered to 7th. We had Isaac Hadjar start from the back after a huge power unit penalty and still finish 6th. And we had F1 Academy not racing at Spa, but still making news because Alicia Palmowski basically showed up to Zandvoort testing and said, yes, I am still the one to beat. So we have to talk about it. Hey everyone, welcome back to Lights Out, Let's Chat, the Formula One podcast where we make F1 less intimidating, more fun, and hopefully easier to understand. If you are newer to the sport, I'm Michaela, and today we are breaking down the 2026 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa. And before we start, I need to clear up one thing. Spa was not a sprint weekend this year. So if you saw notes floating around talking like it was a sprint format weekend, no. Officially, this weekend had FP1, FP2, FP3, qualifying, and then the Grand Prix, which honestly is probably enough because Spa does not need extra sessions to be dramatic. Spa is dramatic just by existing. This is one of the most famous tracks in Formula One. It is long, fast, beautiful, dangerous, historic, and usually chaotic in some way. It is the kind of track where weather can be different on opposite ends of the circuit, where slipstream matters, where courage matters, where strategy matters, and where mistakes can turn into a really big consequence. And this weekend gave us all of that. Today we are going through practice, qualifying, grid penalties, the lap 1 Hamilton and Russell collision, Antonelli's rebound win, Ferrari strategy and unsafe release drama, Leclerc versus Piastri, Hadjar recovery drive, McLaren's mixed weekend, the DNF, post-race penalties and decisions, and F1 Academy updates. And we have our question of the week because this is a beginner-friendly podcast. I'll explain the weird stuff as we go. If you are new and you hear unsafe release, power unit penalty, tow, undercut, virtual safety car, or stewards, and your brain starts buffering, you are safe here. Let's get into Spa. Before we talk about the actual sessions, let's talk about Spa. Spa is one of those tracks that even casual fans have heard of. It is in Belgium. It is over 7 kilometers long, and it has some of the most famous corners in motorsport. What makes Spa different is that it has everything. High-speed corners, long straights, heavy braking zones, elevation changes, weather risk, strategy options, and because the lap is so long, a small mistake can cost you a lot of time. Some tracks are all about show. Some tracks are all about slow corners and traction. Some tracks are all about straight line speed. Spa is more balanced, but in a scary way. You need speed on the straights, confidence through the fast corners, stability under braking, and enough tire life to survive the race. That is why Spa can expose a car. If you are draggy, you get punished on the straights. If you are unstable, you get punished in the fast corners. If your energy deployment is weak, you get swallowed up. If your tires overheat, your race gets ugly. And if you make a mistake, Spa has enough speed to make that mistake expensive. So, when Antonelli wins here, that is not just another win. That is a statement. Friday started with Max Verstappen on top in FP1, and that mattered because Red Bull has been in this strange place lately where they are not bad, but they are also not the dominant monster everyone got used to. Austria looked encouraging, Silverstone looked messy, so coming into Spa, everyone wanted to know, was Red Bull actually improving, or was Austria just a good track for them? Verstappen topping FP1 gave Red Bull something to feel good about. Lewis Hamilton was second for Ferrari, Charles Leclerc was third, Isaac Hadjar was fourth for Red Bull, Oscar Piastri fifth, Lando Norris sixth, Kimi Antonelli seventh, George Russell eighth, Alex Albon ninth, and Fernando Alonso 10th. The big takeaway from FP1 was that Red Bull looked more comfortable, Ferrari looked competitive, and McLaren seemed focused more on longer run preparation rather than chasing the headline lap. And Hadjar was already one of the more interesting stories. He was fourth in FP1, but we knew he was carrying a massive grid penalty because Red Bull had changed multiple power unit components on his car. A power unit is basically the engine system and hybrid system in an F1 car. Each driver is allowed a limited number of power unit parts across the season. If you use too many, they get grid penalties. Hadjar had enough new components that his penalty added up to a 30-place drop. Obviously, there are not 30 places to drop on a 22-car grid, so in practical terms, he was starting from the back. That makes his weekend more interesting because practice and qualifying pace still matter, but his race pace was always going to be a recovery job. There was also some tension in practice when Antonelli was frustrated with Carlos Sainz, accusing him over the radio of blocking during a fast lap. And that is a good beginner moment. In practice, drivers are not racing each other, but they still need clean track for fast laps. If a slower car is in the wrong place, it can ruin someone's lap. That is called traffic. And at Spa, because the lap is so long and the closing speeds can be huge, traffic can feel extra annoying. So FP1 told us Red Bull had pace, Ferrari was close, Mercedes was not panicking, McLaren was not showing everything, and Hadjar was fast even with a penalty weekend coming. Then came FP2, and Kimi Antonelli went fastest. That was important because this was the first real sign that the championship leader had arrived at Spa, ready to respond. Remember, his Silverstone weekend was heartbreaking. He won the sprint, took pole, looked like he could fight for the Grand Prix win, and then the car developed damage and he finished outside the points. That kind of weekend can mess with a driver, a young driver, a rookie, especially when the entire championship narrative is the lead shrinking. But in FP2, Antonelli looked sharp. Lando Norris was second, Verstappen third, Hamilton fourth, Hadjar fifth, Leclerc sixth, Piastri 7th, Russell 8th, Albon 9th, Alonso 10th. FP2 also had interruptions. Pierre Gasly crashed, damaging the rear suspension of his Alpine and bringing out a red flag. He got out okay, which is the important part, but Alpine lost valuable running time. There was also another red flag interruption later in the session. This made the Friday long run practice a little harder to read because interruptions break up the rhythm. So, for my beginners, basically, teams use practice to understand how the car behaves over one lap and over longer race style runs. When red flags stop the session, it interrupts those plans. It is like trying to bake something and every 10 minutes someone turns off the oven. You can still learn things, but it is not ideal. By the end of Friday, the weekend looked incredibly close. Mercedes had Antonelli on top, Red Bull had Verstappen constantly near the front, Ferrari had both cars in range, McLaren had Norris right there, and Piastri dealing with interrupted running, including a reported hydraulic issue limiting preparation. So, the big Friday headline was Spa was not going to be simple. And that is exactly what we want. Saturday's final practice, FP3, gave us another Antonelli statement. Antonelli topped the session with a 1:45.990. Norris was second, just 0.139 seconds behind. Verstappen was third, only 0.148 seconds off. Russell was fourth, Hamilton was fifth. That top group was tight. And that is what makes Spa qualifying fun, because when the gaps are tiny, a toe can matter, a yellow flag can matter, one lockup can matter. One little lift can ruin a lap. Now, for my beginners, a toe is when a car ahead cuts through the air, and the car behind gets a speed advantage because it has less air resistance. At tracks with long straights like Spa, a toe can be worth a lot. It can help you gain speed down the straight, but there is a trade-off. If you are too close in the corners, you lose downforce, and the car can feel worse. So, teams have to plan it carefully. FP3 also gave Ferrari a scare. Hamilton crashed late in the session, bringing out drama right before qualifying. Ferrari had damage to repair and not much time to do it. That mattered because Hamilton had been fast all weekend. He was second in FP1, fourth in FP2, and fifth in FP3, even with the crash. So, Ferrari had pace, but now they also had pressure. And this is where the weekend started to feel like a proper Spa weekend. Fast cars, close gaps, red flags, repairs, grid penalties, and the championship leader looking very calm for someone who had a bad previous race. Qualifying was another huge moment for Antonelli. He took pole with a 1:44.361. That was his sixth pole position of the season. And it is exactly the response Mercedes wanted after Silverstone. Verstappen qualified second, just over 3/10 behind. Norris qualified third, but he already had a 10-place grid penalty for taking an extra control. Norris qualified third, but he already had a 10-place grid penalty for taking an extra control unit, so he was going to drop to 13th for the race. Russell qualified fourth, Leclerc fifth, Hamilton sixth, Piastri seventh, Lindblad 8th, Larson 9th. Hadjar also reached Q3, but with his power unit, he was going to start at the back. There was drama in Q3 too. Red Bull used Hadjar to give Verstappen a tow down the straight, and that is a smart team play. Hadjar's own grid position was already wrecked by penalties, so using him to help Verstappen made sense. Now let's talk about the pros and cons of Red Bull using Hadjar for a tow. The pro is obvious. If Hadjar is starting from the back anyway, helping Verstappen qualify on the front row is a smart use for the second car. That's teamwork, that is strategy, that is Red Bull maximizing the weekend. The con is that it can look a little rough for Hadjar. He is a driver too. He has his own race, his own confidence, his own reputation. And If fans only see him being used to help Max, they might forget he was also really fast himself. My take, I do not mind it here. Hadjar already had the penalty. Verstappen needed the toe. Red Bull needed a result. That is just smart racing. But I also want people to remember that Hadjar was not just a helper this weekend. He was fast. And then on Sunday, he backed that up. Leclerc and Hamilton were also frustrated in qualifying because they had to lift due to a yellow flag in the final portion, costing them a shot at improving. So, Ferrari left qualifying thinking we had pace, but we did not quite get the result. And McLaren had the weirdest feeling. Norris did a great lap, but because of the penalty, he was not starting third. As a McLaren fan, that honestly hurt. Piastri qualified 7th and would move up with penalties, but McLaren still did not look like they had the cleanest weekend. So, the front of the grid after penalties looked different from the raw qualifying order, but the big headline stayed the same. Antonelli was on pole, Verstappen was right there, Ferrari was lurking, Russell needed points, and Spa was ready to cause pain. Let's pause and explain grid penalties because Spa had a bunch of them. Imagine you were playing a board game, everyone lines up to start, but before the game starts, someone says, "You used too many special pieces, so you have to move back 10 spaces." That is basically a grid penalty. In F1, teams are allowed to use only a certain number of power unit parts during the season. If they go over that number, the driver gets moved back on the starting grid. So, Norris had a 10-place penalty for a control unit. Hadjar had a much bigger 30-place penalty for multiple power unit components. Stroll had a 10-place penalty for a MGU-K change. Alonso had enough power unit component changes that he had to start from the back. Sainz also had a 10th-place penalty for a control unit change. This is why qualifying can get confusing. A driver might qualify third but start 13th. A driver might qualify well but start at the back. And if you are new, you might look at the grid and think, wait, didn't I just watch qualifying? Why is everyone somewhere else? Welcome to Formula One. We promise it makes sense eventually. Kind of. The race start gave us the biggest drama almost immediately. Antonelli started from pole, Verstappen was right there, Leclerc was in the fight, Hamilton and Russell were also close, and then at turn 5, Hamilton and Russell made contact. Russell had gone around the outside and had enough overlap to be entitled to racing room. Hamilton stayed on the inside, understeered, and made contact with Russell. Russell went off into the gravel. His race was over immediately. That was a massive championship moment. Russell came into Spa as Antonelli's closest championship rival. He was already trying to close the point gap, and before the race could even settle, he was out. Hamilton was given a 5-second penalty. The steward said Hamilton was at fault, but they also noted factors: opening lap, reduced grip, compressed racing conditions, and the fact that Hamilton tried to avoid contact rather than making an aggressive move. So instead of the standard 10-second penalty, he got 5 seconds. Now let's talk about pros and cons for Hamilton's 5-second penalty. The pro Hamilton side is that lap 1 is messy. Everyone is close together, the cars are heavy, the tires are not fully settled, drivers are fighting for position in a compressed pack. Hamilton understeered. He did not look like he purposely drove Russell off. So, a 5-second penalty recognizes he was at fault, but also that it was not malicious. The con is that Russell's race was destroyed. Hamilton continued and finished 4th. Russell scored 0. So, if you're a Russell fan, 5 seconds probably feels like nothing. That is the hard part with penalties. The punishment does not always match the damage. Sometimes one driver gets a small penalty and the other driver loses everything. My take, I think Hamilton deserved the penalty. I do not think it was dirty, but I do think he was at fault. Russell had earned racing room. Hamilton could not keep enough separation, and the contact ended Russell's race. 5 seconds is probably fair under the current guidelines because it was lap 1 and the stewards laid the factors. But emotionally, if I am George Russell, I am furious because your championship fight just got punched in the face on lap 1. And if you're newer to F1, this is why penalties can feel so weird. A penalty is judged by the incident, but fans react to the consequences. The incident might be worth 5 seconds, consequence might be a ruined championship weekend. Those two things do not line up. While all that was happening behind him, Antonelli had the race he needed. He started from pole, he managed the opening phase, he dealt with the pressure, and even though Leclerc inherited the lead during the pit sequence, Antonelli came back. With around 10 laps to go, Antonelli found a way past Leclerc and took control of the race. Then he brought it home. This was his 6th win of the season, and after Silverstone, it felt important. Not just for the points, for the message. Silverstone could have shaken him. Instead, he arrived at Spa, topped important sessions, took pole, and won. That is not normal rookie behavior. That is a championship behavior. Charles Leclerc finished second, and honestly, this was another strong Ferrari race. After winning Silverstone, Leclerc came to Spa and looked like he could win again. He benefited during the pit sequence, led the race, and defended well for a long time. But Antonelli eventually had too much pace. Leclerc finished only 1.952 seconds behind. That is close enough to hurt, but it is also a huge result. Ferrari has now shown real race winning pace across multiple winnings. Barcelona was Hamilton, Silverstone was Leclerc. Spa was nearly Leclerc again, and that matters. Max Verstappen finished third, and that gave Red Bull its 300th Formula One podium. That is a big team milestone. For Verstappen, this was also a useful result. He did not have the pace to beat Antonelli or Leclerc, but he stayed in podium contention and brought home strong points. And after the recent Red Bull questions, that matters. Red Bull needed Spa to show that Austria was not just a fluke. This was not a win, but it was a podium at a track where you need efficiency, speed, and confidence. Hadjar also finished 6th after starting at the back. So, Red Bull had both drivers show something positive. Lewis Hamilton finished 4th. On paper, 4th is not terrible, but the actual day was messy. First, he got the 5-second penalty for the Russell collision. Then, Ferrari had the unsafe release during his pit stop. Hamilton was released, clipped a Ferrari mechanic, and immediately stopped once he realized what happened. The mechanic fell but was not injured. The steward said Hamilton was not at fault. They fined Ferrari. The stewards also said the incident did not create a sporting advantage for Hamilton. In fact, it delayed him. So, this was not a Hamilton penalty after the race. It was a Ferrari team penalty. Imagine you are at a busy drive-thru. The person helping you says go, but someone else is standing in front of your car. You start moving because the light says go. Then you realize someone is there and you stop. That is basically what happened. In F1, the pit crew has a system that tells the driver when it's safe to leave. If the team releases the car while someone is still in the way or while another car is coming, that is unsafe. In this case, Ferrari's communication got messy because Hamilton had a 5-second penalty to serve, a front wing adjustment request, and another Ferrari car already involved in the pit sequence. That does not excuse it, but it explains how it got so messy. Another big drama point was Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri at turn 5. Piastri tried to go around the outside of Leclerc. They made side-to-side contact. The stewards investigated it and decided no further action. Their reasoning was that Piastri had some overlap, but his front axle was not ahead of Leclerc's front axle, and the stewards did not think Leclerc purposely crowded him off, so it was judged as a racing incident. McLaren finished 5th with Piastri and 7th with Norris. That is points for both cars, but it does not feel like enough. Piastri had a solid but slightly frustrating afternoon. Norris started 13th because of his grid penalty and recovered to 7th. He also set the fastest lap on the final lap. That shows pace, but it also kind of makes the weekend more frustrating because you think, where was that when he needed track position? Norris had a slow pit stop that cost him time, and without that, he may have challenged closer to 5th or 6th. So McLaren is still in this awkward space where they are fast but not winning. And as a McLaren fan, that is emotionally rude. Now let's talk about Hadjar, because this was one of the drivers of the race. He had a huge power unit penalty and started from the back and finished 6th. That is massive. He was fast in practice. He helped Verstappen with the tow in qualifying. Then he put together a really strong recovery drive on Sunday. This is one of those performances that newer fans might miss if they only looked at the podium. But in F1, finishing 6th from the back is a huge deal, especially at Spa, where strategy, traffic, and tire management all matter. The bottom half of the points was also interesting. Balletto finished 8th for Audi, Lindblad finished 9th for Racing Bulls, Colapinto finished 10th for Alpine. Those are valuable points, especially for teams fighting in the midfield. For my newer fans, the midfield is basically the group of teams not usually fighting for wins, but fighting for points. Every 8th, 9th, or 10th place matters, because those few points can decide millions in a championship prize money, team momentum, and driver reputation. Balletto continues to look like one of the stronger rookies. Lindblad keeps adding to a quietly impressive season. Colapinto getting Alpine into the points is useful on a weekend where Gasly finished just outside in 11th. And honestly, this is why you cannot only watch the podium. The podium tells you who won. The midfield tells you who is building something. Let's organize the DNFs. The official not classified list was George Russell DNF on lap 0 after contact with Hamilton at turn 5. Sergio Perez DNF after 13 laps for Cadillac. Lance Stroll DNF after 25 laps for Aston Martin. Russell's reason is clear from the race and steward decision: collision damage after contact with Hamilton. Stroll was reportedly called in with a clutch problem. For Perez, the official classification confirms the DNF, but I do not have a confirmed official technical reason for the race classification itself. So, until Cadillac or an official team report clearly states the cause, I would not label it as engine, brakes, gearbox, or anything specific. And that is important because this is where F1 content can accidentally become misinformation. It is very easy to say, oh, Perez retired with an engine issue, just because that sounds normal. But unless it is confirmed, we do not say it. So for Perez, the safest wording is Perez retired after 13 laps, with the exact cause not confirmed in the official race classification. That is not as dramatic, but it is accurate. And we like accuracy here. Now, let's list the official penalty and decision drama clearly. Hamilton received a 5-second penalty for causing a collision with Russell at turn 5. Ferrari received a fine for unsafe release of Hamilton's car during the pit stop, where the mechanic was clipped. Hamilton was not given a sporting penalty for that incident. Leclerc and Piastri were investigated for contact at turn 5, and the stewards took no further action. Alonso was required to start from the back because of the power unit component changes. Sainz had a 10-place grid penalty for a control change. Ferrari also had tire return infringement fines earlier in the weekend, and Carlos Sainz was investigated in FP3 for an alleged failure to slow under double yellow flags, but the stewards took no longer action. So this weekend was not short on paperwork. If you are new to F1, welcome to the sport where the race ends and then you have to wait for PDFs. F1 Academy did not race at Spa this weekend, but there was still relevant F1 Academy news. Alicia Palmowski swept both sessions on day 1 of in-season testing at Zandvoort. Then she did it again on day 2. So yes, Palmowski continues to look like the driver to beat. And this matters because F1 Academy is heading into its next race round at Zandvoort on August 21st through the 23rd. Palmowski already leads the championship after her strong Silverstone weekend. Now she goes into Zandvoort race build-up with even more momentum. This week's question of the week is, was Lewis Hamilton's 5-second penalty for the lap 1 collision with George Russell fair, or should the penalty have been harsher because Russell's race was over? Because this is one of those F1 questions where the rule book answer and the fan emotional answer might not be the same. The rulebook side says Hamilton was at fault, Russell had earned racing room, Hamilton understeered into him, but it was lap 1, conditions were compressed, Hamilton tried to avoid contact, and it was not on purpose. So, 5 seconds makes sense under the guidelines. The fan emotional side says Russell was out, his championship hope took a massive hit, Hamilton kept going and finished 4th, so is 5 seconds enough? My answer, I think the 5-second penalty was technically fair, but emotionally unsatisfying. I do not think Hamilton intentionally wrecked Russell. I do not think it was dirty, but I do think Hamilton caused the collision and deserved the penalty. Would 10 seconds have felt more fair because Russell retired? Maybe, but penalties are supposed to judge the driving infringement, not just the outcome. That is where F1 gets frustrating, because the outcome matters to fans, it matters to Russell, it matters to the championship, but the stewards still have to look at the actual driving action. So my final answer is 5 seconds was probably right by the rulebook, but if you are a Russell fan, I completely understand why it feels too soft. Now, I want to know what you think. Should penalties be based mostly on the mistake, or should the consequence matter more? Because Spa just gave us a perfect example of why that debate is not going away. My biggest takeaway from Spa is that Antonelli looked like a champion this weekend. Not because he won, because of when he won. After Silverstone, people were ready to question the momentum. The lead was shrinking, Russell was closing, Ferrari was rising, Red Bull was improving, McLaren was still there, and Antonelli answered by taking pole and winning at Spa. That is huge. But the weekend also showed that the championship is still complicated. Mercedes is strong, but Russell's DNF hurt. Ferrari is fast, but Hamilton's race was messy and the pit release was scary. Red Bull is improving, but not yet controlling races. McLaren is scoring, but not delivering the big breakthrough. Hadjar is becoming a serious storyline. F1 Academy continues building stars, especially Palmowski, and the FIA stewards gave us enough documents to make everyone's head hurt. Spa did what Spa does. It gave us speed, chaos, emotion, penalties, strategy, and championship consequences. And honestly, that is why we love it, even when it makes us want to scream into a pillow. That is it for this week's episode of Lights Out, Let's Chat. We covered the Belgian Grand Prix, Antonelli's win, The Hamilton and Russell collision, Ferrari's unsafe release, Leclerc's near win, Verstappen's podium, Hadjar's recovery drive, McLaren's frustrating weekend, the DNFs, penalties, and the latest F1 Academy update. Make sure you answer the question of the week: was Hamilton's 5-second penalty fair, or should have it been harsher because Russell's race ended immediately? Leave your answers in the comments or send us a message. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please share, please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share it with a friend, or send it to someone who is trying to understand Formula One without being yelled at by gatekeepers. Next up is Hungary, and after Spa, I am not going to pretend I know what the season is doing anymore. Until next time, lights out, let's chat.
From lights out to the checkered flag, this has been Lights Out, Let's Chat podcast. We'll see you next time.